we look at the past, I would hope we can get inspired by looking at the craftsmanship and looking at the details and long to build better because we see beautiful things like this. Welcome to Buildings and Brew. I am Brent Hull. I am the owner of Hull Millwork and Hull Homes. This is 7th talk we've given, so we're kind of coming to the end of this little series. Today we're talking about Levittown and mid-century architecture and design. We're really talking about post-World War II till about 1940, 45 to 1960. So should be really fun. If you've ever wondered, why new houses are ugly, this is why. You're going to learn in this talk what happened to housing, what happened to design, and the war kind of blew everything up, literally and figuratively. And so I think this study is fascinating, and I also think it's a little bit tragic. So I've got mixed feelings. I want to thank my sponsors, Kukin Brothers. I was told it's not Kukin, it's Kijken. Who told me that? It's a Dutch name. She's left. She came here and told me that and she left. Oh, there you are. See, there you are. You're hiding back there. So Ryan Mokeen, if that's true, you guys need to change your name. And when Windsor won, of course, those guys. And then we just picked up a new sponsor, Rockwool, is sponsoring these Buildings and Brews. So we're very excited to have them on. We've kind of stopped doing foam insulation on houses, and we're moving to a Rockwool, some different ways of thinking about insulating. So excited to have them on. Okay, here we go. So Levittown and mid-century modern. Everybody heard of Levittown? No? William Levitt? Okay. So we're going to talk about life after World War II, what happened with this 20 years we'll talk about, the style of houses and kind of what happens with design and style. It really takes a back seat to speed and production, and we'll talk about that. That's the tragic part of building that we're going to be talking about. Rise of production builders. Realize that before 1945, there's no such thing as the D.R. Hortons, right? There's no such thing as the large production tract builders that are building thousands of houses a year. This is when that starts. And then our legacy, what we're dealing with today because of how they taught and talked about building. As you know, on these Buildings and Brew, we started with Georgia and Federal. We talked about the United States. We kind of capture a time period. And so 1950, population 150 million, color TV, Elvis Presley, kind of a cool time, right? Wouldn't want to list it, but we got nuclear subs, Leave It to Beaver. These are the big cities. Notice Los Angeles has popped up there now. Los Angeles booms after World War II. And you'll start to see a lot of West Coast and southern cities show up in there when you get to the 60s and 70s. All right. So we kind of have to go back before we can go forward. And part of what you have to understand about 1945 and 50 is what happened before then. And so the Great Depression happens in 29. Everybody heard the Great Depression? Okay. Bad times, right? Housing starts as lowest in 1933. I'll talk more about that. There's almost 1 million housing starts in 1926. By 1923, there's barely 100,000. So there is a dearth of houses that have been built. The building starts to kick back up, and then the war starts, and then they ration and they say you can't build houses at this time. So for 42 and 43, you weren't even allowed to build. And then we get out of World War II in 46, and we start rocking and rolling. Now, what's interesting is that that's very clear from this is that the U.S. comes out of World War II as strong and as powerful as they've ever been, maybe their most powerful time. Realize that Europe is completely rebuilding. Every major city has been bombed and or destroyed, and so they are starting over, and the U.S. is just cranking, right? We've just, our war production, our war machine, and all that stuff has happened, and so there really isn't a pause for us, and it's really during this period of time, a lot of things are being bought from Europe. We're supplying a lot of things to Europe, and so for the next 15, 20 years, it is a boom time in America, which leads to a lot of building and then a lot of growth, commercial, consumerism. We'll talk all about that. Just show you what a plan book looked like in 41. It's there is modern design, okay, and you'll see modern design going back to the 20s. I mean, you could argue that arts and crafts period is a modern style, but in the pattern books and in the plan books, most of what you see is still traditional designs, and then you'll see occasionally this kind of modern thing thrown in there. Houses are smaller, okay, they're not as big. There is, and we'll get into that and we'll talk about that, but these are fairly small houses. We go into 45. We see a little car in a garage, okay, attached to the house, kind of a new thing that's going on. It's still traditional designs with a kind of a plopped on garage to the side of the house. Design still fairly traditional, right? By 1950, you see a lot more of this kind of stuff, the mid-century modern, that sleek modern design, the glass with the windows that go horizontal. High windows is part of that style. It was a privacy window is what it was called. But there's also in these same plan books where you see mid-century things. And of course it's called mid-century because it happens in the middle of the century in the 1950s and 60s. Thought to stop around 69. Again, very popular design plan. The house wasn't very big. You see a mix of these different house styles going on here. And the garage, one car typically being plopped on side the house. In the builder magazines at the time, this is 43 and 44, okay? War market issue, okay? Look at this one, how to build with what you can get. What they're talking about is there are rations in building, okay? You couldn't get copper, you couldn't get a lot of materials, and so one of the reasons houses get cheaper and smaller is because you can't build big houses. How to keep busy in wartime. Isn't that fascinating, right? Builders, and we'll talk about architects, are dying for work. Probably architects, we'll talk about architects and where their role is in another talk, but I mean, imagine being a designer in 43 when, first of all, very few houses are being built. No one needs an architect, right? And so they're looking for work, they're looking for things, and so, but builders are too. There's a whole, strategy that these builder magazines are pushing and shoving about, how to work during this time. How to get an early start on building for G.I. Joe. This is 43, I think, or 44. Even before the war ends, you'll start to see them pushing to, okay, when this war ends, what are we going to build? I think this modern building tomorrow is one about what happens after this is over. And I think in 43, I don't even think we thought we could beat the Germans by that time, right? And so, it's not till 44 that we start getting hopeful about that stuff. And even as early as 43, prefabrication, okay? They are interested in building faster and cheaper, okay? They are interested in this prefab idea that shows up in the 40s that ends up with mobile homes in the 60s and 70s, right? This idea of prefabbing what we're building and things like that, and we'll see this theme and this idea of building better. The housing crisis, okay, so after World War I, what happened to American economy is that there was mass unemployment. And so they were afraid as they're planning in 42, 43, 44 for unemployment. But what actually happened was that there was a housing crisis because the war ends in 45, 9 million vets come home. And we are not ready for these things. Here's an ad in the Roger Young Village made out of Quonset huts. They basically bought surplus Army Quonset huts, and on this base, I think there's 13,000 people applied for 1,500 little Quonset huts. I mean, people were living in railroad cars. People were doubling up with family. Here's some ads that are in the paper that this guy in '89 found. No sympathy or charity wanted, just a home, whatever you have to offer. We aren't perfect, just normal people. Vet, wife, child, won't you please call us? You know, pages and pages of these things of people looking for a place to live. Vets coming home, they get married, they start having kids. You've heard of the baby boom. That's when it starts, right during this time as we're going forward. So, 1926, okay, 26, okay. We've been cruising along since 1893 as they've been tracking housing starts. Now, today, housing starts, if the economy is healthy, is about 1 million housing starts, okay? They didn't get close to that. Well, they got close to that in 26. They got to 900,000. And then you see what happens in 33, 99,000. Started to get a little bit of a peak right there, got over 500,000. War happens, it drops right back down again. So this 20-year period of time, starting in 26, 41, that was a big year, 706,000. But unemployment's at 18%, right? We haven't been building houses for 20 years. So from 1926 to 1946, when the war ends, there's, you know, what we should have been building is about 18 million homes. Instead, there was about 6.5 million in that time. So the number of houses just weren't there for all the people that were coming back. And realize that home ownership in the 40s was 44%. Do you know anybody know what it is today? About 64%, right? So 65, 66, I think it got as high as 67. So in this time period, home ownership was low and there was a dearth of houses, which is the reason why I had a housing crisis. The government has a plan. They get this guy, what's his name, Wyatt? The Wyatt Program. So the war ends, everybody knows there's the housing crisis. The government says, we're going to appoint a senator to do the Wyatt Program to start building. And here you see a hint at William Levitt when he's talked about how he built in spite of the Wyatt Program. Now the Wyatt Program meant there was rent control. A lot of houses being built at that time by Levitt were for the rental market. And so they had a rent control system in place. They had the size of house you could build. And what Levitt is basically doing in 46 is saying, we've been building 1,000 houses despite the Wyatt Program. So the government got in there. He lasted, Truman appointed him. He lasted about a year and got pushed out of the way. So the Wyatt Program was not a very long-lasting program, and they kind of got out of the way and let builders build. Now, there's a bunch of great books. They're not all Amazon books, or I would put them in a description in the link. But this is probably the most important book that was written in 44, okay? The 20th Century Fund. Basically, it was a government research fund that asked the question, the government basically did a study, why can't we build houses like we build cars? You know, cars are in mass production, they're beautiful, they work well, why can't we build houses like that? So what they did was they, did this study and they found out 4 things. Home builders are regionally local, meaning that the guy works in Fort Worth, he doesn't work in Dallas, doesn't travel very far. That guy typically builds 1 to 4 houses a year, not building hundreds of houses. He's undercapitalized. He doesn't need money, but he doesn't have a line of capital at the bank. He isn't overextended, right? He's a responsible builder. And they're saying that that's bad. This is the worst part. Home builders craft homes instead of building them with a production mindset. Yikes! Yikes! That's the problem. We're crafting houses instead of building them boom, 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 okay? So you can see where I'm going with this, right? The tragedy of home building. And so, I got this picture because this is a 1920s catalog. This very romantic vision of home, this very romantic coming with the family and everything else. That's we're not building houses that way anymore. We are building houses fast and cheap as we can. One of the things that came out, this is the 1950s article, but there was all kinds of obstacles to building for Levitt and for others that they kind of hadn't thought of. most of the codes were written in the 20s, okay? We're now in 40s and late 40s. This article is written in the 50s, and they're saying, look, if you want us to build a house like they're building cars, this is what our car would look like, because you're not allowing us to build the proper way, right? We've got new things here, we've got an old thing here, and there was examples of these problems with housing. They were talking about the plumbing code, that they weren't unified, that today we have an international building code for this exact reason, that you have a plumber code that doesn't apply to the building code, and they're not able to build and do things. They couldn't use plywood initially because plywood wasn't a tested product. And so they had to sheathe the houses with wood sheathing. They wanted to do it with plywood. They couldn't because it wasn't allowed. All these examples of things that were keeping them from building, but you're seeing what the industry's wrestling with. They're wrestling with, get out of our way and let us build fast as possible.